It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, hello. Welcome to Islands at War podcast. Month by month look at the occupation of the Channel Islands, not just Guernsey at the bailiwick now, Jersey included. October 1942. So I'm Keith Pengelly and I'm joined, of course, by Nick Hury.
Hi, Keith. How you doing?
Not so bad. We continue to be very, very busy at the moment, but we have got a full month here. October, a very, very busy month, as we will see as we go through. So we're going to dive straight in. Okay, now, Nick, this is something I think you raised an eyebrow before we came on air. Chip shops, fish and chip shops. Well, let's just say chip shops at the moment. And this is from Herbert Winterflood, has derived this some time ago from a gentleman called Bert Cochrane. He mentions Bert Cochrane's diary. Were you aware of Bert Cochrane as a diarist?
No, I wasn't actually. So I must check that out.
Yeah, that's the name that suddenly popped up in Herbert's piece in his diary. Well, it's not so much a diary, it's a roundup of Guernsey press events. But anyway, so chip shops. Herbie reports that chip shops would only be open on Saturdays due to the potato shortage. And Cochrane, the diarist, thinks that the queues would be something to see, and I can imagine they would be. But what were they using for cooking oil? They must have brought some in from France or something.
Yeah, they tried various different things. I know Frank Strubant, he tried all sorts, including linseed oil.
Linseed oil, yeah.
Nearly gassed himself with trying to use linseed oil. And you mentioned that he even tried cooking a cormorant when things were getting a bit tight.
Yeah, Frank Strubant was a Guernseyman that ran a cafe in St. Peter Port until he was deported, and it was called the First and Last.
Yeah, and he also ran the People's Cafe, I think it was called as well.
People's Cafe. I mean, I think with Frank, he's such a character. Obviously, he's long past now. I do remember seeing him. Maybe he merits a special at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Herbert Winterflood also reports that there was now a gas curfew. What with the daylight hours shortening as we go into the autumn and winter, the Germans extended the restrictions on gas use. Restrictions now would apply from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. and from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. People who broke those restrictions, known as the gas curfew, which also included the use of electricity, could be or would be brought before a police court and fined up to 10 shillings on each charge. So not something that you would look to do, break those restrictions.
There was a limit as well as to how much gas that you could use in cubic feet, and it varied throughout the occupation. But if you exceeded the amount that you were permitted, they just came round and cut you off.
Well, yeah. Well, of course, these restrictions would obviously brought in to harvest the, to save gas, save the use. There's also a number of the diarists mention that on the 26th of October, a miniature cyclone struck Guernsey and the damage was reported across the island. And this event was followed by nearly a week of torrential rain. People were blown from their bicycles and there was much damage to greenhouses. And this is reported, as I say, Nick, a lot of diarists writing about that.
The weather was absolutely shocking in October 42.
Yeah, I mean, it features in all of the diaries that we mine for information. Blackout procedures. Now, the Germans were not happy about the island's attention to the blackout. A warning was issued that careless blacking out would be met with our friends' severe punishment. So, yeah. Air raid wardens, Dick, they were Guernsey people, they were attached to the police department?
Well, now, therein lies a story. The air raid wardens existed at various points, got disbanded at various points, were reinstated at various points, got given different duties rather than being air raid wardens. One of the chaps that was involved in organising it ended up basically going out and assessing damage predominantly caused by the Germans from firing their artillery and stuff like that, or from Allied air raids, rather than doing ARP.
So the German military didn't get involved particularly with air raid precautions. It was devolved down to to local people.
They did make some rules, or rather got the civilian government to introduce rules which said if you had to let any passer-by in the event of an air raid siren going off, or the alarm siren as they called it, you had to let any passing stranger into your house, which I think Lesotho mentioned a few months.
This is in
back,
Jersey, yeah.
In Jersey, you had to put a notice on your door how many people were supposed to be in the house, so that they could work out, if the police came around, they could work out whether you had people in there you shouldn't.
Yes, of course, we did cover that. There was a major robbery in St. Peter Port in Guernsey. There was a store called Luff's. I seem to remember the name. This is in Back Street in the suburbs of St. Peter Port. And a large quantity of foodstuff was stolen, and the thieves used the firm's truck to take away the loot. I mean, how on earth did they get away with that? They also, Nick, I think you know, you've got a little bit about this. They had a meal on the premises before heading off in the truck with their so-called loot, and they tampered with the food they left behind. Is that right?
Yeah, this is pretty shocking. Whoever did this. Now, of course, we don't know if it was islanders or whether it was Germans. Could have been either. I've not been able to find any conviction for this, albeit it may be out there somewhere. But they broke in. Not only did they ransack the entire place, all floors of the building, and it was a systematic raid, the press report said. From top to bottom floors, whole store was ransacked, and they carried away a large quantity of goods, foodstuffs naturally, as it was one of the main grocery businesses and suppliers to all of the branches of Luff's around the island. But not content with doing that, they made a large meal of the food that they found there whilst they were still on the premises, opening some of the tin stores. And it was the newspaper report says it was the character of their theft was made more emphatically despicable by the fact that they left some of the contents of the open tins but rendered them useless by pouring disinfectant into them. And as a final gesture, they borrowed the firm's trucks to cart away. I mean, you would have thought that was fairly obvious if you're driving around, because there weren't many vehicles that were allowed. Well,
exactly. And the fact that it may have been not so much an inside job, but it was the assistance of the military.
They didn't go very far, though, because they finally abandoned the vehicles in Mill Street. So it's only like 500 yards away or something like that.
Yeah.
Very, very, very odd. But Luff's had been particularly unlucky. They'd suffered several raids over the previous months. They had a store in Union Street as well, which is relatively nearby, a 5-minute walk or so up the hill, depending on how fast you walk. And there were other break-ins at the State's footwear manufacturer and repair depot at Pier Steps. That was entered during the lunch hour whilst nobody was there, and footwear was taken. In that case, the thieves were apprehended, although I don't have any names for those. Now, this is indicative of what a lot of the diarists talk about. Particularly Lesotho in Jersey talks about the distress of the occupation and the hardship caused by it is turning people who were normally upstanding citizens into thieves because they were getting so desperate. And that's, that's by October 42, things get a lot worse.
And I think, people might feel driven to it because of that they're providing for their families. If a family man goes and steals something and shares it out with his family, it's completely different to someone just stealing something and hoarding it for himself. So there's an element, I think, of justification why people were doing this, and ordinary, upstanding citizens turned to theft.
Yeah, absolutely, through desperation and not as a sort of life choice. Okay, now one of the things we're going to turn to a piece by the Reverend Ord. Now, Nick, there's been a 2-part TV series recently. Is it just 2 of 2? Yeah, 2 of 2. The last one was on last night.
Yeah, so I think on various...
It's on Channel 4.
Channel 4, so they've got to sort of see it again.
Yeah, 4 on demand. You can watch it again on there.
And one of the characters, one of our regular diarists, all of you that follow the podcast will have heard of Reverend Ord. Now, he's actually, for those that you haven't seen the TV program, he's actually played by an actor in the TV series, in the TV episodes. Now, I've only seen one of the two, but I thought it was very, very convincing. The actor that played him very, very, very well.
I also thought there was a striking resemblance, actually. I've seen a number of photos of Ord, and it very much looked like Winifred Harvey is also in there.
Yes,
as well as some Jersey characters. I did have, when the company behind this, Minnow Films, got in touch with me January, February last year when they were pitching the idea to Channel 4 to do something on the occupation for the 80th. And we talked about things like, where could they find some information, find something to do a bit different. And we talked about the diaries, and we had quite a lot of emails, and I gave them sources so that they might want to look at. So it's quite pleasing to see. I'm always a bit nervous when people ask me about stuff for TV programs, because there's always that danger they'll just go down the whole sensationalist and not check the facts and stuff like that. I mean, there's I wrote a little review of this, and there's very little I can criticise them for. It's down to things like the wrong sort of... They used, obviously, stock footage of bombing at the start of it for the bombing of St. Peter Port and St. Helier. Okay, that featured some of the wrong aircraft.
Yeah.
It's not really a biggie. I mean, I noticed, but I doubt your average man...
No, because that wasn't filmed. The raid on the 28th of June, nobody filmed that.
No. And then Alistair Davidson, one of my friends, spotted quite a niche one here. You can tell that he's an advocate. He noticed that they showed the outside of the Royal Court here and the inside of the Royal Court in Jersey.
Ah, right. Well, again, that's pretty niche.
That's pretty niche. But a really good spot. But other than that, to be honest, I thought it was pretty good. I couldn't really fault it. I quite like the way that they're doing it. That they have the views of a number of diarists, a bit like what we do.
Yeah.
Now, the guys had I think by the time I was talking to them later on in March, we'd done a few episodes, and I'd sent them links, and they had a bit of a listen to those as well. So yeah, I think it's pretty good. So I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and people can go and take a look at it. But I think they did a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, I've only seen one, but I will catch up with the second one. But we're big fans of the Reverend Ord, and here in October 1942, he's talking about suicides amongst the German military. Ord himself is taking a funeral at Les Foulons, the big cemetery outside. It's within the parish of St. Peter Port, not far from where Ord himself actually lived, where he sees some Germans digging a grave. And he talks to the sexton of the Foulons cemetery, who tells Ord that the grave was for German suicides. And he says that, and these are Ord's words, these unhappy men were to be denied burial at the military graveyard at Fort George, where anyone who is interred there is regarded as dying a hero's death, and suicides were interred at the Foulon. There's no German military graves at the Foulon now, are they? Are they still there?
I'm not aware of any. I must admit, I've not looked, but I don't think so, because they're normally looked after by Commonwealth War Graves Commission, even if they are.
Yeah, we'll look at this intriguing question.
We'll look into that. Now, I am aware that there is a grave that is a German that is up at it's either St. Saviour's or St. Peter's. I'll have a look at St. Peter's tomorrow because I'm up that way. Where that was a German who was disgraced German, and I believe he was shot, and he's buried there, but again without honours and only basic information.
Yeah, well, of course, people would say, well, why were these Germans committing suicide? Mainly, the raids on Germany, flying fortress raids now in Germany. So the Americans were involved. And of course, German civilians were dying in the same way that civilians were dying in Britain. And of course, soldiers were losing their parents, their wives, their children.
Yeah.
And it is documented that some of these men just couldn't take it anymore, and they decided to end it. They had nothing to go back to Germany for. I don't think it would have been for this whole thing about, I could get sent to the Russian front. I think people would have would have gone. I think it's more because of family tragedy that these suicides occurred.
The news was filtering through, and or some of the Germans know that Ord listens to the radio, and they talk to him. It wasn't unusual for Germans who appeared to be friendly to some of the local population to actually ask them what the BBC News was, because they knew that the news of what was going on in terms of bombing raids was being suppressed on their own radio.
And of course, they were going on leave, coming back and seeing the devastation that was caused in Germany.
I've seen accounts from German officers, where they've got all the way home to Hamburg or Berlin, and they've got there and discovered that because it took so long for messages and stuff to get here, they find that their house has been completely destroyed,
and their families with it,
and their families with it, and stuff like that. Or the alternative is perhaps not in October 42, but certainly by early 43, they're trying to go on leave. They're getting part of the way home, and then they have to come back because the trains are being disrupted so much.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And the infrastructure is so badly damaged that they don't actually make it all the way home, which must have been really, really disheartening for them.
And the other thing I think we covered off is that there were German combatants coming back to Guernsey or being stationed in Guernsey, having been through the grinder that was the Russian front. They weren't able to sort of serve on the front line, so they may have come to Guernsey or Jersey in administrative tasks, so no longer in the front line. And they were, of course, coming back and discussing what they had experienced on the Russian front. So that's the Reverend Ord there, talking about suicides. One of the, because we got quite a bit bigger items to go through, Nick, but there's also this one here. Oh, I tell you what I did want to mention about Ord is that we sort of speculated that he hadn't given his wireless set in, but it turns out that he was going to the Chilcot family to listen.
Oh, was it? Oh,
yeah,
okay,
so I just picked that up in one of the Diary Boober. So, okay, now tell us about the King's Head badges.
Okay, so this is one of the acts of defiance which went on for quite a while. So, of course, on the coins, I think it was on the shilling coin or something like that. Can't remember off the top of my head. But of course, the King's Head was on the coins. And what a number of people were doing was they were manufacturing badges, just the King's Head on, by snipping off the edges of these coins. Now, this is part of the problem why there weren't very many coins around as well. It wasn't responsible for the whole issue, but it was certainly responsible for part of the problem with getting British and Guernsey coins. So they were doing that. Now, of course, you couldn't just march around with that on your lapel all day long, through town. You'd get into trouble. So what they did was they put it under the lapel.
On the reverse side of the lapel.
Reverse side of the lapel of the jacket. And then if they saw somebody that they trusted, they'd lift their lapel and flash the badge. And it was just a way of geeing each other up. Still a fairly hazardous thing to do.
Was it one person doing this, or were people doing it for themselves, to speak?
No, there were a couple of guys that did it on an organised basis. I'm sure people did it themselves as well, but you can go and see examples of these at the Occupation Museum. And the name of the chaps eludes me for the moment, but I will have a think.
Okay, and then we also experienced, or people here in the war, in the occupation, were, and I guess this also took place in Jersey, the German forces rapidly giving you an order to move out and find elsewhere to live at a moment's notice. You had to, in most cases, take your furniture with you, and if in some cases the Germans liked what you were taking, they would tell you not to take it and leave it behind. And you had no recourse at all here. And one of the incidents that happened in October 1942 did affect a very elderly gentleman who has quite a story. And in fact, he was turned out of his house, and he was a relative of one of the diarists, and the place that he went to live was actually my house, the house which we're sat in my studio right next to. And what we've decided is this whole issue of turning people out of their houses for billeting reasons. We'd probably look into that in depth and put this as part of a special, Nick, because there's quite a few stories to do with this. So
yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, just going back to the being turned out of your house, it's not unusual to see that people have ended up being kicked out of where they originally lived. Then they move somewhere else, and then a few months later or a year later, they then get booted out of that house because the Germans have come up with a reason for wanting to use that house, or they've decided that they want to demolish it for military reasons.
Yes.
You know, there were, I think it's about 300 houses roughly that were demolished during the course of the occupation. So, you know, there were people that sometimes moved 4 or 5 times.
Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to turn that into a special. And the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that diary entries across the diaries that we look at in October 1942 were still commenting on the fact that the deportees were on their way to Germany. Yeah. And we're going to talk about that in depth in a special, I think, in September.
Yeah, I figured we'd do one in September for the first round of deportations so that we can talk about that.
So it is something that comes up month on month, depth. But we're going to corral the whole thing together and do a special in September. And we will return, as I say, to the notion of billeting and how it affected certain people and how they reported it. Now, one of the things, Nick, that Ord also references is the Sark raid, and that the BBC covered it on the 7th of October and mentioned the capture of a Guernsey evening press. This is the BBC reporting from London, I guess, that got hold of a Guernsey press. This is the Basalt raid on Sark, and this is quite a lot of detail in this. So off you go.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask anybody to name a commando raid in the Channel Islands, they're going to say Basalt. It's the most well known. It was also, you know, it had massive ramifications, which you'll come to in a
There's a lot of controversy and myth about it as well.
Yeah, and a lot of propaganda from the Germans. And a lot of the Germans playing the Geneva Convention / Hague Convention, we'll make it up as we go along, our version thereof, things like that. So originally this was supposed to take place on the night of the 18th, 19th of September 42, but that attempt had to be abandoned because the weather was rubbish. So they had to abandon that one. So it actually took place on the night of the 3rd / 4th of October. And there is a memorial in Sark to this raid, and it's got a great plaque which explains stuff. Now, I'm quite glad, because in my younger days, I used to go down to the memorial, but it's right on the edge of the cliff, and it's about 300 feet down. So these days, I don't quite fancy going and standing next to it
I only
anymore.
go so far as well.
But they have got an information board, which is much closer. Now, I went over for the 80th anniversary. I was invited to go along for the 80th anniversary because they had a rededication of the monument, because they discovered an extra couple of names that hadn't been on the original monument, but they'd been able to confirm that these chaps took part in it. And some of these people weren't strangers to the Channel Islands. You had Major Geoffrey Appleyard, or Apple. We touched on talking about him with Operation Dryad, which was the raid on the caskets in an earlier episode. And also Anders Lassen was involved in this raid.
Can you just give us a bit of background about Anders Lassen? Because he's really quite he's very, very famous to some people, but he's unknown to others. But he really was a real hero, wasn't he?
Yeah, he went on to win the VC shortly before the end of the war, when he unfortunately was killed.
Was he Danish?
He was Danish, and again, he's very, very famous for being involved in raids like this. Now, it's quite a complicated little story. So they came up. For anybody that knows Sark, then you'll know some of these places. But what was quite good, I've done this walk a number of times now. Tim Osborne, a friend of the show who's been on a few times, and tour guide, does a really good Sark tour, which I've been on a few times. And we started at the Hog's Back, which is the name of the the headland that points out. It's very rocky, very difficult to get up if you're coming from the sea. For the 80th, there was a reenactment of coming up the cliffs. I wouldn't fancy doing it in daylight.
No.
And certainly not carrying all that kit, because they were doing it in authentic kit. And so they did a reenactment. We followed them all the way through the way that they went. So they went along the cliff path, Hog's Back. They got a bit confused at one point because they thought there was a German patrol, but actually just a little way along the Hog's Back there, you can still see the remnants of it. The Germans had a shooting range, and they had cut-out targets, a bit like that they use currently. But I think these were slightly more substantial, a bit more like having a scarecrowy type thing.
Yeah.
And they had those there, so they stopped along there because they thought, hang on, it's a German patrol. And then they realised, actually, it's not moving. It's not a German patrol. They headed down towards Petit Dicard, which is a really, really nice farmhouse. We were lucky enough when I went on Tim's tour that the gentleman that lives there was willing to let us go on there, and he gave a jolly good talk about what went on there. They found that there was nobody there, Petit Dicard, so they went up to and again, if you're familiar with Sark, overlooking Dicard Bay is a house called La Jespellerie. It's a big white house. It's been rebuilt, I think, or certainly modernised since. It's not used as a house anymore. It was used for winemaking, but I believe it's empty at the moment. But there they found Mrs. Pittard, who initially they broke in, and poor woman, they initially gave her a bit of a shock, and she thought they were the fire brigade because they had their faces all blocked, all blacked out and whatever. And eventually she realised she's wandering around in a nightgown, and then she realises, okay, no, they're not. They're not actually firemen. They're British commandos. And she was very helpful because she provided them with information about where they could find the Germans, because they were a bit confused by now, because they thought they would have at least come across a patrol or something like that. Because the whole idea of this raid was to gather intelligence as to what was going on in Sark. And the wider Channel Islands as well. And they thought they'd have, been able to, like the Dryad raid, snatch a few soldiers, take them back for a bit of questioning. So she pointed out to them, actually, if they went to the Dicard Hotel, which is not that far away.
Which is pretty much in the centre of the island. It's some way from the cliff edge,
It's quite away from the cliff. You go up the Dicard Valley. Yeah. You can either go up the Dicard Valley or you can come along, you've gone up the other side of Dicard Valley and gone up towards the Jespellerie, and then you've got a slightly straighter run along a road. Well, as much of a road as you get in Sark. It's not, not a fancy tarmac road or anything like that. And she told them that there were a bunch of Germans there. So the commandos made their way there.
Can I just come back to you? But didn't they ask if they could have a loaf of bread?
Yeah, they wanted to take the whole loaf, and she said no chance.
But can you explain why they wanted the bread?
They wanted to be able to test the quality of the bread.
That's right.
When they got it back.
That's right.
So she said, you can have a small slice, but you're not having my entire loaf of bread, because basically I think that was her bread for the week.
Because the thought process was, if you analyse the composition of the loaf, it would tell you about if the loaf composition was regarded to be very poor quality. It gave you lots of information on conditions generally, didn't it?
Yeah. So they described her as an old lady. She wasn't. She was by no means an old lady. I can't remember her exact age off the top of my head, but I think she was in her early 40s or something.
Oh, crumbs, I always thought she was about 70, 80.
No.
Yeah.
No, she wasn't.
Yeah.
But they described her as an old lady. She most certainly wasn't. I think she would have probably been quite offended if that had been communicated to her. Anyway, so they make their way along to the Dicard Hotel, where they discovered a sentry. Now they were near the annex to the Dicard Hotel, which has been rebuilt. I think it was rebuilt in the 70s. So it doesn't look quite the same as it did back then, but you can kind of get the idea. And so there was a sentry there. They decided, well, what are we going to do? Anders Lassen, who was Danish, it's just come back to me, went up and used his commando knife to take out the sentry silently.
So he did kill him.
Yeah, he killed him.
Yep.
And so they went into the annex of a hotel where they captured 5 Germans and restrained them by tying their hands. Now, this is the controversial bit. The Germans got very upset about the fact that they banned their hands. You're not supposed to tie prisoners and whatever, but the rationale for doing this was that they needed to be able to maneuver these guys down the cliff paths, etc., to get them on the boat.
So they were going to take all 5.
They were going to take all of them.
Yeah.
Anyway, a bit of a punch-up started when one of the German soldiers basically realised that, hang on, there's not actually that many of them. Maybe I've got a chance of getting away now. Bearing in mind, these guys were only wearing their nightshirts as well. So this German started to resist and cry out. And in the ensuing melee, 2 of the prisoners were shot dead and 2 escaped. At which point the commandos beat a hasty retreat with their 1 remaining prisoner back to the Hog's Back.
Okay, so 1 German prisoner is dead. The sentry's been taken out.
The sentry's taken out. Two of the guys are shot dead.
Are their hands bound at the point that they've been shot dead? Yes, and this I think is where
this is where the problem comes in. So that causes massive uproar and leads to what most people will have heard of as the commando order. Now, there were in fact 2 commando orders. This is the second one, but this is the one that actually gets enforced and leads tragically to the demise of a lot of special forces commandos, anybody behind enemy lines in uniform, basically. It led to the death of a lot of them because Hitler decreed that they were not to be spared, they were to be questioned, and then they were to be shot.
Executed, yeah.
Yeah, and just like the Great Escapers, the 50 that were, taken and never survived. They get driven out into the countryside. Oh, do you want to go for a toilet break? Get out the car and finally get shot. So it led to widespread issues. The Germans kicked up a big fuss about the raid. They didn't actually report it immediately here, but rumours started getting around, so they kind of had to deal with it. But they phrased it around the terms of, it was completely futile. The headline is how Germany views futile attempt. Now, it did also mean that Hitler ordered that the prisoners from the Dieppe raid have all their hands bound and shackled, which lasted for, I think it was a couple of weeks before they gave up on that idea in the end.
Okay, so the two guys that have been shot with their hands bound, I think that was spun that they'd actually been executed,
yeah,
as opposed to it being a sort of kerfuffle. So that means there were 3 other Germans. So they capture 3?
No, captured 1.
They captured 1, so 2 got away, didn't they?
Yeah, 2 got away. And on the information board, they do have the names of them. Unteroffizier A. Blair, apologies for the pronunciation, Obergrafreiter P. Oswald, and Grafreiter H. Esslinger. Now, I know there is some talk that Oswald didn't die during the raid. He just happened to die at the same time, and possibly he wasn't killed on the raid. Now, I don't know.
I think Simon Hamill covers this off in one of his books.
In one of his books, yeah. So whether that's the case or not, I don't know. You'd have to. Simon knows far more about this than I do. So you'd have to look at one of his books. But the Germans wrote a report on it. You can get a copy of the report. I've got a copy. And they initially the former company commander, because you've basically got a company commander in charge of these guys. They were engineers, and he was relieved of his command and was to face court martial. And another, a Corporal Schubert, was also to be court-martialed. But it took, it was 5 days before they ended up putting anything in the papers. The English papers were all over it. The Sphere, which was almost like a magazine type paper, had lots of photos, and it had photos of the harbour in Sark and stuff like that, and a big write-up about the raid. They also had a rather dramatic picture of the boat, the MTB, that they went on, that was drawn for them. And there was big controversy about this raid anyway. But they got away with their one prisoner and got some very useful information. They did take with them a Guernsey press, which Mrs. Pittard had given them, because obviously that contained useful information in terms of restrictions and things like that.
And she was taken back to Guernsey for questioning, wasn't she?
She was, yeah.
And I think also a gentleman, a member of the Carre family, I think, there was diarists talk about, this was pretty common knowledge that there had been a raid on Sark, because it really gave the Germans the jitters again.
Yeah, absolutely. And here and in Jersey, Lesotho talks about it in his diary about the raid on Sark has really made them nervous. And now the rumours that were going around were that 50 Germans had been killed.
Yeah, an enormous.
And then you had German counter rumours. You had Germans running around telling people, no, it was 50 British were killed during the raid, and all of this sort of malarkey. But it wasn't until the 9th of October, so you had 6 days later, that this is being reported by the Germans.
Because one of the ramifications in Sark is that the Germans then sort of corralled themselves up into this military zone in the area Sark hasn't really got a town, but where the German fortification, the German command was, they sort of created this military zone, didn't they?
Yeah,
with barbed wired it all off and created fields of fire and mortars and minefields.
Yeah, absolutely, and islanders ended up having to move into the centre of the island. They were forced to do that as well. And again, this leads to the usual threatening notices about harbouring people and always the threat of if you hide them you could be shot. If you hide bits of equipment that they've left behind, you could be shot. All of this sort of malarkey is what the messages that are being put about by the Germans, not necessarily in the notices that they put out, but that they refer to their usual thing of you'll be brought before a German court military, so you mustn't get involved in this, and there are various notices that are published around that sort of thing.
Now, the other thing, staying on Sark, Nick, I wanted to talk about the Skeltons, this husband and wife that had bought a farm in Sark in the 1930s, their Rondellery farm, and then they arrived, retired to Sark on the 28th of June 1940, which was the very, very day that the Channel Islands experienced the air raid that killed many people in St. Peter Port, and they also raided St. Helier as well. And so incredible timing to decide to come and live in the Channel Islands. Major Skelton had been in the Royal Engineers. Both he and his wife spoke German fluently. The Major owned land and had agricultural interests in Sark. He insisted that he know the whereabouts of minefields, etc. So he wasn't afraid to sort of butt heads with the Germans, and it would appear that he was on a list of people to be deported to Germany into one of the internment camps. But his wife's name wasn't on the list.
Yeah.
But it appeared, possibly, that they agreed to a joint suicide pact in order to avoid this deportation. Their bodies, they were found on common land in Sark at the very end of September. Major Skelton himself was dead, but Mrs. Madge Skelton was found to have taken a drug overdose and had slashed her wrists, but she was alive. She was treated by a German doctor on Sark and then sent to Guernsey for further care, arriving back in Sark in February 1943, and she stayed in Sark throughout the occupation. Now, there are differing accounts as to her injuries. She was said to have been stabbed 16 times. So the question, if that was right, was she stabbed by her husband? There are various photographs of Mrs. Skelton at ease with German officers, and it's unclear if these photographs were taken before or after her suicide attempt. And in one of the Channel Island occupation reviews, there is a note which is photographed where she is in December 1943 inviting dear Lieutenant Hurt and Dr. Schock to come and see her at her residence on Boxing Day for coffee. So one of the things that is, I think we're both aware that there was this sort of rumour that has been floated that Major Skelton was a British agent, but why put him in Sark? I mean, but the whole thing is a bit curious, isn't it?
It is a bit strange, but the fact it's not like he blew in the day before.
That's exactly.
He bought the land quite some time previously, and we've covered this before. The Channel Islands were a very attractive place. If you'd served in the military and got to a reasonable status, or you were, perhaps independently wealthy before you joined the military, or you served around the empire in the civil service, and all the government of India and stuff like that, then when you came to retire, well, I want to go back somewhere near home, but I don't want to pay all the tax.
Yeah.
You know what? The weather's quite nice in the Channel Islands, although you wouldn't believe it based on when I had to go out and do a tour last night. The weather's pretty good. I'll only have to pay 2p in the pound, or actually in Sark, you wouldn't have been paying it.
Well, nothing at all.
Well, no, and they pay a sort of property tax based on the size of their property and whatever. So that was a massive saving over what they'd have paid in the UK. Lots of things like booze and cigarettes, a lot cheaper here. In fact, in one of the escapes that I write about in the book, one of the reporters that interviews the two of the chaps that escaped remarks about how their yacht was very well provisioned, and he wished they'd bought more cigarettes and more whiskey with them, because he was like, because they sold him a couple of bottles of whiskey and some cigarettes, and even though they made a profit, he was still buying them an awful lot cheaper than he would be able to get them. Yeah. So just one of those things. So the Channel Islands were a really popular place. I mean, you've only got to look at who was in charge of the ARP in Jersey. That was a bunch of ex-military men. Probably not the best idea the Germans ever had, because actually they were going around. they
gathering information.
It gave them access and an excuse to be out and about when other people weren't, and they were gathering information and getting it smuggled out of the island. So, there were a lot of military people. There were a lot of military people or ex-military people here. So he wasn't there as a spy, and why would they have sent him to Sark?
I think that the controversy centres around his wife's friendship with Germans. We're not really sure why she was able to speak fluent German. He would have probably been, there was a reason for him being in the military, but it's going to be one of those things that is never really up to the bottom of it. And I think after the war, she remarried. She married a lawyer.
Okay.
And I don't think she stayed in Sark. I think she moved away. And it's probably one of those little things that's been puffed up to be far more than it really was. And we know that there is a great desire to try and identify people that might have been here in the occupation that were MI5 or MI6 or something that had been left behind. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about what one that made some comments on the day of liberation. We'll get there in the end.
Yes, there are us.
So we will return to that notion. Yeah, we will return to that.
I mean, just while we're still talking about Sark, I mean, Lesotho is...
This is our correspondent in diarist in Jersey.
In Jersey. He is highly amused by the German article, condemning the raid on Sark, because he points out that it gives away that actually they weren't very good at sentry duty or, guarding the place, because the fact they were in nightshirts only gives away that they were, in bed. So who the heck was doing the guarding, and how come they didn't, raise the alarm beforehand? And he finds the indignity of them being captured in their nightshirts quite amusing. He also says it explains generally why the OT in Jersey are such a disgrace, as he puts it. But equally, he's amused by the fact that during the panic following this, the OT have been made to do a guard duty all night.
So the German military forced the organisation Todd into...
They got the joy of being on guard duty all night, and then, you're back to the day job.
Oh, right. So
he finds this hilarious. He says, well, that's one little laugh culled from the paper. And he said, it contains a few words that dispels some of the boredom. The curfew gets changed as well around the Channel Islands because of Basalt. So it changes to 9 o'clock in the evening till 6:30 because they're obviously getting a bit jittery. Although Lesotho himself, he does make me laugh because he's writing all this stuff down in a diary, and he openly admits he'd be in big trouble if anybody found this diary, and so much so that he says then there are so many regulations, but he says I've broken so many of them that if they sentence me for each of the ones that I've broken, I wouldn't live long enough to live out the prison sentence. And he's not bothered about breaking the curfew either. He quite regularly left a neighbour's house after an evening of playing cards an hour or more after curfew and never got caught.
Lesotho's diary was published, wasn't it? No?
Yeah, it is.
Is it still available?
Yeah, you can get it. You can even get it on Kindle, actually. It's called Diary of Jersey Under the Swastika, a daily account. And it's by Philip Lesotho, and it goes all the way through the occupation. And I just think he's a brilliant character and a really, really interesting one. Now, he does note that if you do get in trouble, even for a relatively minor thing, that's bad news because you end up on a blacklist effectively, and they will cause you problems for if they need some hostages for something.
Oh, yeah.
Or they want to, there's been an act of sabotage, so they need, a bunch of men to go and guard telephone cables and stuff like that, then you're going to end up being put up for that sort of thing. But he's like, whatever. And he's even says, well, I might end up getting sent to Germany, but I'll have a bit of fun along the way kind of thing. And he does also say that Nakfus is not such a nice man as his two predecessors, Gussack and Schumacher. And he says, bitterly as I loathe the Germans, I must admit we were justly, even generously treated by these two, which is more than can be said of recent events, which is kind of the theme that we've come up with before, isn't it?
Well, last week when I was on duty at Fort Grey, I was visited by John and Frank Osier. Frank is a spry 93. Lives in the UK now, but had gone out to Australia. He remembers being evacuated, and we're going to do some recording with Frank and John. Whilst we were talking, they sort of asked about, did we talk about Jersey? And I mentioned that our diary friend Lesotho, who, complained once. They thought this was amusing. They complained once that St Helier wasn't being attacked when St Peter Port was.
Oh yeah, he complains about that a lot.
Yeah, he got most miffed the fact that Guernsey were getting something that Jersey weren't. And Frank and John were quite amused by this.
Good old inter-island rivalry.
Yeah. So Frank and John, I know you'll be listening to this. We will be in touch, of course. Now, the other thing is that Islands at War does have a Twitter profile, and it is, Nick, just help me out here. What's our Twitter profile?
It's at Islands at War.
Yeah. Now, we've been tagged in by some people, and I think you want to have a brief word about this, because it's sort of dragged us into something, hasn't it?
Well, it's all very, very strange, and I really don't understand what's going on. And if you look at the Twitter feed, you might see some tweets by us which look a little bit strange. That's because the account that keeps tweeting at us, it keeps deactivating itself when anybody asks any awkward questions like, who are you and who do you represent? the long and short of it is there's a couple of Twitter accounts, British Channel Islands War Memorial and Force 135, which has popped up most recently. They predominantly put out AI generated short videos and things, but they also put out various things bemoaning the fact there aren't any memorials, which they seem to have changed their tune on that one and conceded after I went and took a load of photographs of all the memorials that were within 100 yards of each other down at the White Rock for starters. And so they seem to have conceded that, but now they're campaigning. They seem to be writing to MPs and stuff like that. Now, I offered several times for them to come on the show. We'd record. We'd love to know what they were up to. You know, what was their particular interest? Why did they think there weren't enough memorials, or not the right type of memorial from their point of view? And got some very strange answers. Things like, "Oh no, we only talk to the accredited media." To which I pointed out, well, funnily enough, we end up on the. I've had the BBC on the phone 3 times this week, both from here, Jersey, and in the southwest. I was in the Guernsey Press again the other day because they rang me up about the show that we talked about. So, it's not like we're not known for talking about these things.
Exactly.
And if they have a genuine campaign, I'd be interested to know about it. But they just, for somebody that's supposedly running a campaign to achieve some sort of remembrance and recognition, they're very opaque. They won't admit to who they represent, who they are, or anything like that. I do actually know who 2 of them are, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to mention them. But I just think it's a very funny way of going about things. They keep tagging us, and in some cases it would appear to be in an attempt to give some form of credibility to validate whatever they're to their Twitter account and try and to drag us in by association. So I just really wanted to say, I mean, I really couldn't give a monkeys, but it's getting to the point now where they're kind of dragging us in, and I don't want people to think we're in any way associated with this. We're if they turn out to have a sensible plan and a real reason for, they think something's been overlooked, I'd love to know about it. But given they won't talk to us, it's a little bit difficult. And as I say, they keep deactivating one of the accounts, so the tweets disappear after a while, or they pop up, tweet, tag us, and then scurry away, and then don't always get a chance to reply. So it's very, very odd.
So if you follow us on Twitter and you see these little sort of spikes of these people, we're really not in the condoning anything that they might be trying to sell.
We just love to know what their rationale is and stuff like that. Which, considering that the whole premise appears to be a campaign for remembrance, surely you'd want to talk to people. Yeah, it's very odd. Anyway, let's move on. I've had my little moan.
It's out there now. What was also out there is your book.
Yes.
What's it called? It's a brilliant title.
It's called Tides of Defiance.
And how can people buy it?
They can pre-order it. It's not going to be out until August, but you can go to Barnthorne Publishing's website and you can pre-order it. Pre-order it there. It's all about escapes.
From all of the Channel Islands?
Yeah. Obviously, I haven't been able to feature absolutely every single one because there were quite a few. And it also talks about some other aspects of the occupation along the way because they're pertinent to what goes on in terms of the escapes. We look at the changing attitudes of both the civilian population, the civilian government, etc., towards those escapes. The impact that they have on people that are left behind. That kind of stuff.
Available in August from all good bookshops and Amazon, etc.
You can pre-order it now as well.
Yeah. Now, you've also, this will be going out, I think, on Tuesday, and we're sitting recording here on Friday evening, but you're doing some tours this weekend, but you will be doing some beyond this weekend, beyond the Spring Walking Festival, you and Joe?
Yeah, Joe. So Joe May, one of my friends, who's a silver accredited tour guide. I'm a lowly bronze accredited tour guide at the moment. We've teamed up to do Spring Walking Festival, Liberation 80. which we've called the Road to Freedom. We actually did it for the first time with paying customers last night because we had somebody got in touch and wanted to do it as a corporate event. So we did that last night. The weather was not ideal, shall we say, but actually it eased off just in time for us to start. Yeah. It was a little bit on the mildly moist side at times, but it did ease off. They seemed to have a great time, and yeah, we really enjoyed doing that. We'll be doing that again.
This will be repeated again after the Spring Walking Festival.
Yeah, we've talked about it. We'll probably do it again in the summer. We've also got one that we've put in for the Autumn Walking Festival as well, which is a different tour. So yeah, and I'll be working on bits and bobs to do that. What else am I up to? I'm in London in 3 weeks' time. I'm speaking at a private dinner in London. I've been invited to go and talk to a historical society there. And then in September, I'm speaking at We Have Words with the History Festival, Al Murray and James Holland. And that's quite a bit out on one side. I'm really looking forward to it, and it's a pleasure to be a speaker there to students.
Yeah,
I'm dead chuffed that I'm going to be doing that. So
and plug the book and plug the podcast.
Well, the timing just happens to be perfect for the book. Yes. And so I'm really looking forward to doing that. That's in September. But other than that, busy doing all sorts of research and stuff. Should mention actually as well, Matt Godion, who lives in Jersey, who has corresponded with us a reasonable amount. He's written an article that I'll be putting up on the blog. It's all about the operation that went through Jersey to rescue troops from France before.
Oh, yes, that's very interesting. Yes, the mini Dunkirk.
Operation Ariel.
Yes. Well,
so he's written a really brilliant article for the blog.
It needed to be done that because it's a fascinating tale.
Yeah, he's done a really good job of it. And that'll be coming out on the anniversary of that, which is later on this month. So do look out for that. That'll be on my website, islandfortress.com.
I also entered the Spring Walking Week, and I took my tour, My Family in Wartime, last Sunday. I had some wonderful people from the UK, some people from the United States who sent me an email to tell me they've left me a present at the Piet Hotel. So I need to go. So thank you very much for that, Judith. And then we had some locals. I'm going to run the tour again on Sunday, the 15th of June. That's My Family in Wartime. We walk through some beautiful parts of St. Martin's, and I feature many original documents and family photographs, etc. I think, that's probably it.
Yeah, we probably should wrap up. I've just got one thing, actually, that I will mention. Two people that I know, Andy H. and Merrin Walters, have got a podcast called News of the War, which they are picking a random date throughout the war and looking at what was in the newspapers, and it is an absolute cracking podcast. They've also got a great sense of humour, so they find some funny stuff in there as well, which is well worth listening to. I really, really enjoy it. It'll really give you a little bit of a giggle as well as covering off some of the serious aspects of it. So I just thought I'd give them a shout out. You can find them on all the usual podcast platforms, but they're great fun.
Okay, so I think that's it, and we'll be back in a fortnight with November 42, and I'll be talking soon to Teresa Lefemme, talking about her the sequel to her novel Sequence, and of course Jenny O'Brien, yourself and Katie, that was very popular.
Yeah, that one's been really, really popular. That was a great chat about the Book of Lost Children. That's a brilliant book as well. I highly recommend reading that. That's absolutely excellent. It's fiction, but based on fact. And as we were talking earlier about, I'm quite picky about my facts. Couldn't find anything wrong with it.
Well, we have some very talented people here that live on the Channel Islands. I know Jenny, she's Irish, but lived here a long, long time.
She's written a lot of books.
Yeah, a lot of books. Very talented. Okay, I think we really must go.
Yeah, we better go now. Otherwise, we're going to be well over time. So.
Okay, so it's goodbye from Keith, and it's also
Ala Prashoin
from Nick. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. As sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone, left on a ship 'cause they knew